This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, special guest Amanda Stanaway joins us to talk about hybrid work 2.0.
Woo!
Now I have all of these Australian songs in my head as an opening, which I'm not going to attempt to sing. But this is what a Joey sounds like. And this is what an executive producer and woman at work, Jess Vander, sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess.
And the reason I have those Australian songs stuck in my head right now is because we are joined by a special guest this week. Amanda Stanaway is a workplace design leader, works at a company called ERA-co, and works on designing and building all kinds of corporate environments, commercial spaces, future of cities. And this is what Amanda sounds like.
Good morning, Joey and Jess. I think, I sound like an Australian, which is a really great thing as a starting point. So that's not surprising.
Agreed.
Agreed. Thanks for having me on.
You're spicing up the audio track of our show dramatically.
More dulcet tones.
I could have said good day. I could have said good day if I was going to be really funny. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So we did an episode a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago or so, give or take, about Jess brought the question of why do we keep failing at hybrid work, or why haven't we figured out hybrid work yet? And one of our friends, a former coworker, Christina, reached out and was like, I work with Amanda, and Amanda has a lot of opinions and a much more expert knowledge about hybrid work. And so we hopped on a call with Amanda, and some of the conversation started getting into this arena of there are so many competing incentives in the conversation about hybrid work between leaders and the teams that they lead, between the corporation and the employees, between cities and communities and the companies that have people coming in. And so we realized there's a whole conversation that will hopefully take a lot of turns, but we wanted to ask that question: how do we respond to the competing incentives of hybrid work?
Thanks, Joy. I think, look, this is something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and it's one of those topics that I think is highly divisive. Prior to the pandemic, I'm a workplace strategist, a workplace designer, and people thought I was an expert. Yet right now, if you start to talk about work, everyone's an expert and everyone has an opinion. And I think one of the most amazing things about the pandemic is that everyone got really focused about what their work life looked like. And so the number one contradiction is that hybrid is this massive blanket term that everyone kind of used to describe so many different tactics, so many different ways of work, and so many different kind of ways that you'd be managed. And I think the real thing that we need to think about, and the reason, and Jess's question is right, the reason why it hasn't been solved, because we actually don't even know what the question is so varied. And what happened, each and every one of us went home to work from home in 2020 and kind of came back somewhere in between there and now. And that really most organizations didn't make change to the physical space, the behavioral protocols. They didn't teach me how to lead remote teams. They didn't teach me how to actually have better online skills. Most of us don't collaborate that much better. Half the world can't use Miro or any of those things. So we kind of basically took the tactics that we had before, added home to it, put a new label on it, and expected that it was going to behave differently. And it just didn't, because actually not many people have gone back and said, if we could start at the very beginning, put a blank page, how would we actually design the perfect ecosystem and experience of work for the hybrid workforce? And I think that's the challenge as we go into 2025. We have to put behind us the fact that the things that happen, we actually have to say, look, who's going to be brave enough to put a blank sheet of paper down and actually rework this to ensure that the experience and all the things that people are both positive and negative about actually are solved? Because the list of contradictions are enormous. And you can just, your last one was about employer and employee. There's culture, there's loneliness, there's the mental health, there's sustainability. All of them are contradictions. But I think if we don't actually accept that we are going to get it slightly wrong, then no one's going to design anything. It's like we're all waiting for the perfect answer, and therefore we've not started designing. And I think hybrid suffers from the fact it's such a broad tactic, and therefore no one's got a specific response. And unfortunately, companies, I'm going to say, are lazy, so they just follow what someone else did. So if someone else has done it, they'll do it.
I mean, I have to shout out that Joey on the side has been, who knows, unbeknownst, maybe beknownst to some, created a story in the form of a Dungeons and Dragons campaign based on a dystopian sci-fi future where us, basically, without revealing too much more, getting distracted, the solution to innovation was basically to let a bunch of different cities experiment with possible ways to save the world. And it's really interesting that you mentioned what you do, Amanda, about, how do you make space to be wrong and like start with a blank slate and try something new, because it's interesting. Like, unless you're in some sci-fi dystopian future, when do we, or maybe we did back in 2020, get the forcing function to actually make a blank slate happen and try and experiment and fail?
Yeah. And I think, look, innovation is one of those funny things when you talk about work. People go, like, if you walk into a major corporation and say innovation is the permission to fail, people will go, whoa, we don't fail in organizations. But I think, like, one of the facts that is true during the pandemic, innovation was at its lowest since the First World War. And so people like me who like to latch onto things might say that's just because we weren't together and we make ideas together. I think there's lots of reasons why that was out. We flatlined in innovation, but we still really haven't come out of that. And so your point, Jess, is actually there's a couple of tactics that when we think about hybrid, the question is innovation flat in the world? And it's not because of a lack of ideas. Is it a lack of cadence to come together? Is it a lack of permission to fail? Or actually, does it have something to do with the fact that people are not coming together and therefore riffing on people, and us playing in Joey's dystopian world doesn't allow us to have the opportunity to do that? So I think there's so many parts of that are really, really interesting to me that we just need to get in and try and solve it and be really honest when we fail.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it, right, is, I had written something at the beginning of last year, and it was informed a lot by the work of this economist, Carlotta Perez, around sort of what happens when a lot of ideas come out and are not distributed evenly, and how does technology distribute and ideas distribute. But a big part of that is like the sort of orientation towards financialization, right? A lot of the innovation that was happening, prior to and maybe even still post-pandemic in that sort of zero interest period was just like, how do you maximize profit based on existing ideas that are out there? And, there was in some aspects like a lot of risk tolerance, but not a lot of commitment to experimentations, where you would throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall, so to speak, and just see which one sticks and like throw all the other ones away, not going through necessarily like a rigorous exercise to see, oh, this one didn't work, but it's because we have to tweak it or do something. I think it's interesting now in the context of hybrid work, where there are a handful of ideas that we could all probably list that different groups are pushing on in this sort of environment of different incentives. But that idea of like, of what is a laboratory, like, democracy, like federalism is the laboratory of democracy, or those ideas that we hear sometimes, like, you're right. When we talk about hybrid work, it is a gradient idea, right? Hybrid between what two things, right? Like completely remote, completely in office. And that idea of like, for a given team, for a given company, for a given group of individuals, that gradient needs to be different. But to your point, you're designing with an intention. What are you trying to accomplish? Yeah. And maybe that's where that point, like the company's incentive and what they're trying to accomplish versus the individuals that are just, they're playing in different zones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things is, like, if you look at some of the global policies of things like Atlassian has a slogan, team anywhere, right? And they have these things called intentional team gatherings. Now, if you make that much money, you can put people in intentional team gatherings and fly them around the world 2 times a year. If you've got a normal business, how do you actually do those same things? So the financial part of it becomes really big to your ability to actually instigate and change big cultural pieces that we haven't had before. And, they're all around this idea of belonging. And so for me, like, belonging, and, so many people talk about belonging, but I think one of the things that we have failed to really recognize, or I'm quite passionate about, is, a human, over centuries, humans have been coming together. They came together originally around the church. They came together in most of my growing life and the generation before around big organizations. And I'm not saying it's the only community people had, but it was a community people had. And I think remote working and taking away the cadence, or actually the power of an organization, has good and bad outcomes. Mm-hmm. But what it is taking away in many ways is a strong cultural community that someone had, and we haven't really put enough brain power into actually how to remake that. And I tell this in a really simple story that, my grandmother met her husband at the church, my mum and dad met at work, right? Like, we haven't rebuilt the social cadence or the connecting tissue around people in a remote workplace. And I think it doesn't mean that corporate is less valued, but I think if you have a look at the statistics that come out, engagement is lower. I think the way that we were passionate about corporations might be really different in the future, because I just don't feel like that people are as connected. But that might just be a passing phase, and that we'll get tactics that bring people back together to believe in value, to believe in community, and actually kind of, I'm going to say, drink the corporate Kool-Aid, because a lot of that has been diminished over time.
Yeah, there was Derek Thompson wrote a cover story for The Atlantic recently called, I believe it's called The Antisocial Century. And in his podcast, he brought on one of the researchers that he said, like, really impacted his way of thinking about that conversation. It's this psychologist named Nick Epley, and a lot of his studies are focused around how does socialization, including sort of like what you would consider like weak tie socialization, impact someone versus how do they think it will impact them. And the big findings he had are around, certainly in America, but in other places he's replicated it with, he's replicated the effect, the sort of people's anticipated response to these social interactions versus how they feel after. The big finding is that there's a huge delta. So he asked people in one of his studies, like, you're incentivized, talk to someone on your train ride into the city on like the Chicago light rail train. And he asked them ahead of time, how do you think you'll feel about this interaction? And they say, I think it's going to make my day worse. It's going to be awkward. It's going to be whatever. And then he asked them after they have the conversation, and universally everyone is like, it was so positive. It was really great. I had this amazing thing. I learned this thing about somebody. I felt better about my day. But that delta between how you anticipate a thing is going to impact you and how it actually will is really interesting. You can say it's just work. Your work shouldn't be your life. The idea of drinking Kool-Aid, all of those things. Like, I believe in those things, and also, like, I enjoy the company of my coworkers, and I have like lifelong friends from that. But if your anticipatory reaction, that how you believe you will feel from having to go in and build those relationships is negative, you have this huge barrier in the way of like building that thing, even if the net is likely to be a positive experience.
I think if you take that and extrapolate that, and you think about, like, I don't know, 8 hours at home on a video call versus 8 hours in a meeting in an office, the different levels of dopamine, how your brain reacts, how you feel. And it kind of is the same thing, right? Like, it's like there is a social there is actually a physical reaction in your body to those different types of interactions. And I do think in the contradictions of how we see the future of work and hybrid, I think you have to think about the idea of burnout and how that actually like the lack of multimodal or not enough social interaction will actually diminish our ability to do certain things and also just tire us out. And I like quite often, because I spend a lot of time in organizations, and sometimes it sounds really terrible, but if I quote theory, people get really quite cranky at me because I'm being elitist versus saying, look, here's a story from my life. And I always say to people, also the idea of break as a really good reason or way to come up with ideas. And like there's a study by, I think it's Arizona State University, a guy called Blake Ashford, and he talks about the idea of that boundaries in your mind is actually a really important part of actually, working. And so like the idea that, you might commute is actually a space in your brain, and it actually is a transition from home life to work life. And that is actually really important. And even if you work from home, you have to create them. But we've never given people these tactics, right? So we don't go and say that. And I say, look, my father and my grandfather used to say when they came home from work, I'll hang my troubles on the door, right? And I argue that I absolutely think working from home and hybrid is absolutely the way forward, and there's no question about it. I think the question is how do we give the human race tactics to optimize their way of responding to that? Because ultimately we're kind of draining ourselves and we think it's really great for us. And I think to your point about the study is we think certain things are good for us. People think working from home is good for them and they like it and it's easy. And I'm like, well, I thought I had yogurt for breakfast. It's also got 20 grams of sugar in it. It's not that good for me, right? Like sometimes we don't exactly know. And I think what we, as a profession, and I think every strategist and every designer in the world will say to you that there are many things that we need to get in and try and solve. And some of them are actually just big social issues. And for me, that is, I joke, is work a team sport? Like, because we're actually kind of almost working into being very solo, which I think is not a great thing. Sorry, Jess.
No, it's really interesting to break down. I mean, we're talking a bunch about sort of the individual employee psyche, but I think the other thing, of course, another core stakeholder, the employer, like what is the employer getting wrong?
Look, I think the challenge, and I'm going to probably put a million people under the bus by saying this, is that I spend my life with the employer. That's who I work for. And the reality is they're too scared to do anything because they're going to disengage the employee. And so you've got CEOs, and I have one single conversation with the CEO generally, which is, what do you really think? Not what do you say publicly, what do you really think and feel? Because they're trying to get operationalizing, they're trying to get profit. And most businesses probably in the last 2 years didn't make that much money dependent. There's vast changes, but productivity has been low. People want to do less, be paid more. We've got wage rises, we've got inflation, we've got all those things that sit around it. And the CEO's got not that many tactics, and usually almost all of them haven't got an engagement score that's going south. And so, and then they've got usually a financial team that says, well, the office is not utilized, can we get rid of it? And what they're not going back to do is saying, what is the experience we want to make of work? And actually, how do I lead us through this? And I think, we've all read the stories about various leaders who've tried certain tactics, return to work at 5 days a week, mandates, all those things in between. But what we haven't seen probably enough of is someone trying to build out the ultimate experience that is employee-centric, but actually benefits the employer. And I think that's probably where 2025, I think, might change, is that I think the power might be a little bit more balanced, where it's been very employee-centric for the last couple of years. And, that's why I'm not going to say no one solved it. Everyone is trying to solve it, but it's so bespoke that most employers fail. But I honestly think that most people haven't turned their mind to it. They just kind of added home into the scenario, and then actually didn't really change tactics, give their leadership teams like the right skills to manage remote teams, because it's different. And I think we're going to see a lot more time spent on that and a lot more money spent on that over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think there is this aspect of the employer-employee dynamic, especially in like fully remote, where all of your interactions are like largely intermediated through text. That is, the question of like, can you be productive, right, feels different to me, or connected but different than like, how do you feel being productive in like the moments of productivity, because there's a big dehumanizing component of like just inherently in the studies that people do. I think that same psychologist, Nick Epley, like looked at where, he talked about it like, where is the source of our humanity? And he said like the voice is a big source of our humanity, because the way in which you deliver it, a message, gives so much additional context about the individual, their intention, right? Like it just fattens the data pipe so much that they do all these studies of like, read this statement, tell me how you think the person feels or what they're thinking, even like polarizing statements that someone disagrees, that they disagree with that statement, and then hear someone actually say it. And the response to that is like, oh, they're a human, they're a mother, they sound a little harried when they're delivering this message, they're in a rush, oh, I can tell that they're thinking through this, right? Like those aspects of it. And when you're, the idea of remote work, some of the conversations are like, corporations are not human enough, they're not thinking about me as an individual, like what is my life like. Some of that connection comes from those like in-person interactions where you actually get to see and understand a person as an individual so that you can make decisions, as opposed to like someone on a team being like, well, do we really need that team? I don't know, like fire them or like eliminate that department or what, like, versus like, oh, well, yeah, we're going to eliminate that function, but these people are really good at this. We could actually use them over here and redeploy resources and whatever. It becomes just much more moving pieces around on a chessboard as opposed to like deploying human capital. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see, I'm going to use Atlassian because it's easier and they're not my clients, so I can talk about it. It's in the public realm. Is that, that their intentional gathering piece is about that. Like it is really truly about harnessing the social quotient, and the studies that come out after it is they get a massive bump in engagement for a couple of weeks, but then it flattens off because it actually needs to be re-topped up. So, because our social quotient needs to be topped up. And I think there that, if you think about like the idea of like physical, like belonging, like there's physical belonging, there's operational belonging, and there's this thing called affinity. And for me, we haven't, you can kind of not really impact, I can't physically impact where someone is if they're remote from me. And I can't really like change the operational distance, but I can change their affinity to me and our relationship. But again, it can't, like, can you make the same connection without physical contact? And the example I'm going to give from yesterday, our team had a really big pitch somewhere in the world, and the client decided to make a drinks part of the pitch. The drinks socialization was rated. It's the first time I've ever seen it in 30 years of working that a client put a social piece of the agenda as the quotient for actually one of the determining factors of whether they would hire you, me, and us as a team. And I thought that was brilliant because it told me that someone was actually getting the real key to performance right. Like, because like, we all can talk about performance, productivity. And actually, I think we miss the fact that the social cohesion of it is actually one of the determining factors, even though I don't know, any equation that you've seen about productivity or performance doesn't have anything to do with social affinity. But I do think it's actually a really big governing factor, and it's the one thing that I believe is universally lost and universally degrading, yet we are persistent in not trying to figure out how we might reinvigorate that. So we see it in lots of our organizations, because you heard it when people first return to work. People will be like, pizza days and this and this and this and this, and like people stop doing that now because they realized it didn't make a difference. And what we haven't got back to is, how does culture and belief, because if you look at the next generation of workers, they'll all talk about belonging and purpose, yet we haven't quite figured out how, or most organizations haven't figured out how to take their values and pull them down into true belonging and belief, and actually get people to come into that and buy into that. And I feel like that we're still in the infancy, and there's some organizations that are making some pretty big inroads and trying very hard about that. So I think it's a tricky time.
I gave this talk recently, and it was about an entirely different subject, but about sort of the rise of thirsty behavior from businesses and in individuals too. And a large part of it is this sort of like hyperfixation on individual needs, right? Like growth or profit or like belonging, whatever it is. But it's making me realize in this conversation so much about hybrid work, the sort of core metric that everyone sort of identifies is productivity, right? Like there was some early conversations at the beginning of the pandemic around performance or things like that. But the idea that hyperfixation on a singular metric, both from the employee and the employer side, I think results that, you guys were mentioning the commute earlier. There were studies, I remember, we may have even talked about it at some point on the podcast prior to the pandemic, like the ideal commute based on studies was 30 minutes because of decompression or ramp up time, like ramp up going into work, decompressing coming out so that you can leave work at the door, like you said. Similarly, like the idea of, you can say, I'm an introvert, I don't need the same amount of socialization as everyone. You still need some, you're still a human, even if your proclivity or need is lower or whatever. But because everyone's like, well, I'm productive when I'm at home and I can focus on all these other things. And well, people are productive. Like it seems like so narrow, the band in which we're deciding to measure like the success or failure of any given program, that then we don't build that holistic picture of like, again, like what does it feel like? Are you well versus like happier with the fact that you don't have to commute? Like, is it okay sometimes to eat your vegetables because you will feel better at, like those type of ideas?
Absolutely. And like, I think no one has a perfect equation for productivity. That's one thing for sure. Like, I still use Zig Ziglar, like his performance, like his very simple formula. But like, I think that there's a lady out of Michigan Medicine who I think she's a clinical psychologist, and she talks
Let's
about
go blue.
That she talks a lot about the emotional energy of working from home. So like, if you're a mum and working from home, like it might be quieter, and people will argue that they can focus better at home. And I would agree that that is probably true for most people, because it's usually quieter and there's not other people around. Most office environments are open plan, although better ones have a diversity of spaces that you can go and lock yourself away. But when people work from home, they actually have their concentration demands like them to actually be able to wipe away everything else that's around them. Because what I see is that I haven't unpacked the dishwasher, that the kitchen is dirty, that the bed was unmade, that there's a pile of washing. So I've got all these other things going on in my brain. So like, people say they can concentrate better, and I'm like, well, good on you, because you've managed to block that out, because I can't, right?
I can't.
So, and like, I'm not saying that is a universal truth. It's just recognizing that the concentration and the emotional energy to work from home is actually slightly different. And she did a really great study that I think is really cute, that you can just think about the fact that yes, it's actually much quieter, but actually you've not thought about the emotional baggage that sits within your home.
Mhm.
And there's all these things that I think that come to unfold to understand that neither point is perfect. And I find it interesting. I did a briefing the other day, and someone was like, I need sit to stand desks and I need this and this and this, and they wrote this whole exhaustive list, the things they needed in the office environment, and to be productive. Yet when they go home, most of them sit without ergonomic adjustment, without the right heating, cooling, because the proxy for performance is often comfort. Comfort's one of the number one proxies to actually allow you to perform. If you're not comfortable, you will not. And so like the environmental conditions at most people's home are not enough or not right. Their ergonomic conditions are usually not that right. And actually almost not all employers have gone back and said, if you're going to work from home and home is a part of your work kit or your work ecosystem, it needs to be fully ergonomic so that I reduce my risk as an employer. And so like, Jess, you asked questions about employers. I think they've been, I'm not going to say lax. I'm going to say they haven't protected themselves, because like ultimately, if I sit at home 3 days a week in a bad chair and work on my laptop all day with my head in a funny position, and then I go to work 2 days a week and I make a workers' comp claim that my head's about to fall off, like that, who's going to determine where that came from? And so I think we haven't kind of gone back, and not because we want to be litigious. I think it's because we haven't actually gone back and said the ultimate ecosystem is to create as much equality as we can between these places and actually tactically use them to support an extraordinary work experience, which is, okay, Joey, Jess and Amanda never like working from home, but actually their flexible component of work is they just work extraordinarily weird times because they're weird, like because they like working at night, or Joey likes gaming and he wants to game all night, so he comes to work late, like whatever it is. But I don't think we've actually, what has happened in the individualization of work is that I said everyone can do whatever they want, kind of. And then we've not kind of tried to create a way that actually universally works. So I think so many of the questions come back to the fact that we are not ready for bespoke or choose your own adventure. And we're trying to, and yet it's really clumsy. And so thus we go hybrid, and it kind of means whatever you want, write the rest of the recipe yourself.
Yeah. Or we need people to choose more adventures for the experimental learning, but that isn't really happening either.
Well, the learning component and the flatlining of learning and mentoring is also a really big part. And I'm fascinated with that running together with not the office being not a primary source of work, plus AI coming together. And I think the two things for me when I think about the future of work, and architecture as an example is the number 3 profession that will get diminished by AI in their reporting. So number 1 is kind of admin, number 2 is law, number 3 is architecture. And I think if you don't come to a studio and learn and listen, and then in the same sense, you work from home and you don't create the socialization, the number 1 part of a job that we're going to keep is ideas, creation, and socialization and communication. And so where do you learn those, or how do you learn those? And I'm not saying you can't. I just think so I think what we're going to end up with is the two ideas of the changing nature of the workforce and AI, and kind of how jobs will become, jobs will change. The jobs that we need are actually quite in communication, socialization, and they come together with the work from home thing. So I see a skills gap in about 5 years.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Jess, this probably brings us to the wrap-up corner. We've covered a lot. So the wrap-up corner may require you just to solve the hybrid work problem. Can you do that?
Of course. That is obviously my contribution to this call.
Of course you can. But I think you need a really, like anything, you need a brave partner. Like that you have to ask every single person that you work with to be brave. No one's going to solve it alone. And every solution is different. So the answer is, I don't think you can solve it. I think you just have to recognize you have to solve it every time uniquely. because it is actually, even the problem statement is so vastly different for every person, as well as every organization.
Yes, and I think that brings that actually ties to maybe one of the first things you said, Amanda, which is that hybrid is this dissatisfying catch-all, that it is used as this broad gradient term to cover so many complex incentives and things, such that whatever the specific scenario, a company is paralyzed with fear of mismanaging all of the possible things, like the stakes of the business being too high to get wrong at this time, hesitation, just not being fast enough, not putting enough investment in or being resilient enough to iterate, reacting too much to the force of will of the employees, of what the employees think they want, or thinking too narrowly about the problem. And it's interesting, the conversation then where we were talking about the individual maybe even being wrong about what they want versus need and what is best for them. And that point about how narrowly we even perceive what success can be measured by. Is it just productivity? Shouldn't it be more? And shouldn't it depend on what the company actually cares about, right? Like, it can't just be productivity that we're all a part of this machine for. Hybrid work should be maximizing happiness. It should be maximizing our ability to avoid burnout. All of these different things that we know are what keep not just companies afloat, but cultures and communities thriving. And so I feel like we've actually done a pretty good number on identifying some of the challenges. The harder work is doing the solving of it all.
Absolutely. And making an extraordinary experience.
That's it.
I believe we can.
We did it.
I think we can.
We can.
Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by, no, leave me alone.
As always, we'd like to thank our executive producer and social grader, Jess Vander.
You're welcome. We'd also like to thank sound engineer and changing workforce, Alex Contel. That didn't make any sense.
We'd like to thank our programming coordinator and egg pod man, Les Jacobs.
And thanks to our most productive, our production crew, Sarah Gilbert, Nora Mestrich, Christy Jensen, and Amy Waters. And
as always, thanks, Ellen. Special thanks to egg pods. We should get those.
Special thanks to our special guest, Amanda Stanaway, for joining us on this episode.
Special.
But also egg pods, sure, yeah.
Yeah, egg pods. Special thanks to work hammocks. We don't have those, but I wish we did.
Do you think it would be the mesh kind or sort of the fabric kind?
Ooh, great question. I feel like the mesh kind seems like more sanitary. I have no idea if that's true. If like so many people are laying in them. Yeah. I have no idea.
But also it doesn't provide your, like, most other seats sort of have a back, and that would be an exposed backside.
Hammock seats? Maybe that's the solution.
Chair. Oh, have you sat in one of those swing chairs?
I've seen like the like lawn chairs that you would like bring, or camping chairs that have like hammock mode. I've seen them, but I've never sat in one.
It's most accessible. It's like a very accessible design, and it's so comfortable. Like sometimes sitting in like a bunch of nets or ropes is not that comfy, but a nice chair that moves.
The thing that you need to know about me is that I had a period where I really wanted to get a hammock in my apartment for a long time. And my parents got me a hammock for Christmas one year when I had like this like pseudo terrace thing on the back. It was just like the roof. They built like a deck on the roof of the building behind us. But I was like, but they never gave me the stand for the hammock. It was just the swinging part that I had nothing to hang it from. And I carried that around to a few apartments. And at some point Becky was like, you got to get rid of this. And I was like, the dream is dying.
No, the dream is dying. Let the dream live. You You do just need kind of a good amount of space for that to happen.
Yeah.
I wonder if
There are demands.
There must be a new solution. Don't let it die.
The
Follow your
collapsible
heart.
hammock. TM.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we did it. Love you. Mean it. Bye.
Bye.